Welcome. We're going to be talking about component libraries. Who has used a component library before? A couple? 3. Great. Well, for the other 247, we'll help you. My name is Garren Smith. I'm the founder of Red Comet Labs. I'm on the Apache CouchDB PMC. I do a lot of work in the front end for CouchDB. I'm also involved in PouchDB. It's a really awesome database that runs in the browser and does this amazing replication thing with CouchDB, so you can combine it with all the service worker stuff that Patrick was talking about and build a great offline application. And Ben here will introduce himself.
Can you hear me? I can be heard. Okay, cool. I am Ben. I'm pretty much just a developer. I do developer things. Currently, I'm focusing on front-end work. That's where I'm building my expertise. I have many thousands of open source things that I wrote once and then completely forgot about. So be free to check out my GitHub and tell me how much I suck for not updating them. And then Garren will take us through too.
Cool. So we're both from Red Comet Labs. We're a JavaScript consultancy. We love doing front-end stuff. We love doing React, but Simon has strictly told us we're not allowed to mention that again for the rest of the talk, but can't obey everything. So let's kind of get onto this component library. So the big thing with component libraries is this something that you actually need in your application? So the first question you've got to ask yourself is, do you have an application with no kind of clear style rules? Do you have like multiple primary buttons that are all a variety of different colors? Do you sometimes use a table to display data? Do you sometimes use a list? Do you kind of have forms that each different page of your forms looks completely different? Are you in a place where you're in a company where you have multiple applications and each of them look completely different? And the big telling sign is, do you have a gigantic amount of CSS and none of it makes any sense? And that's it. People are starting to buy into this. Do you feel like this when you ever have to work on CSS? Or if you have to do any kind of UI components, do you just lie down and cry for a bit? If you do, don't worry. We can help you. We've got some ideas how to show you how you can improve your user interface. Now, apparently, we're not cool enough to have like an AR drone to give away or a Tesla or whatever. But we do have a JavaScript book to give away because guys, let me just emphasize, knowledge is power. So if anyone can give us a convincing argument on whether this is real or fake, because I've stared at it for like a couple of hours now and I'm still not 100% sure, at the end of the talk, we'll be willing to give you a book. So what actually is a design system or a component library? And probably the hardest part of a component library is no one can settle on a frickin' name. So some people call it a design system, some people call it a style guide, the other name is component library. And they all kind of mean the same thing. And Susan Robertson actually has a really nice kind of quote to sum up what it actually is. And she kind of goes, to me, a style guide is a living document of code, which details all the various elements and coded modules of your site or application. So to kind of explore that a little bit more, it's kind of a way of documenting your visual language, how your application interacts. What sizes are your buttons on the front screen? How big or small are they, depending on whether you're using it on an iPad or an iPhone? Or how does your form look? Do you inline it all, or is it, do you make a bigger form depending on what you're doing? You create those kind of clear style rules so you know how to behave, what kind of visual language you use, what kind of wording you use on your application. Ideally, you create a whole lot of reusable components so that you can use them throughout your application easily. And another really nice feature is you can then style multiple applications with your same component library, so you've got a consistent look across all your applications. If you look at something like Airbnb, whether you're using the web, whether you're using the phone, it's consistent. It always feels the same. It's the same experience. And one of the things that's kind of subtle but really useful is you can then version control your design. So you then kind of know what changes you've made, how in production you can decide which application gets the latest style guides depending on what you want to do with it. But one of the most things that's really important to keep in mind when you're kind of building these things, because kind of as developers we get really excited and just want to kind of dive in, but it's actually the process of creating your component library is actually more important than the implementation. You kind of want to sit down with your stakeholders, with your clients and everything like that, and actually explore, what do you want this application to do? How should it behave? And how should the visual language, how should it look, help the users actually go about doing that and achieving that? Ben's going to quickly walk us through 1 or 2 examples of a component library.
Is it on? It's on again. Ooh, you guys are getting a twofer. Right. So let's see if I can do this without being incredibly terrible. There we go. Right, so we're going to take a look at a really, really big style guide out there, or component library, as I like to call it at least, the Salesforce one that they use across many of their applications. And we're just going to focus on something most of us have done, work with forms and the design around forms and the rules around forms. And we're going to start with an input. So what we see here is, if you've ever worked with like Bootstrap, you've gone, I want to use something in Bootstrap, I don't know what it is. Go to / components or parts or whatever the URL is now, it always changes. And you go there and you know, oh, that's what it looks like, that's how it behaves, that's the markup. So that's kind of what a style guide gives you. So here we have an input, we have its markup, so we have that reusability. So we can just go, this is what an input looks like. It's not what you'd expect it to be, because you'd expect it to just be, you know, an input. But there's divs around it for branding and craziness, and there's a label attached to that input. Along with that, we can see all the caveats for the input, and we can see accessibility notes. So, important to note, a style guide isn't just about the presentation of an item or an element or a component, it's about the behavior. And we document that in these libraries. All right, cool. Back to our fancy slides. Boom. So Garren put this one in here because that's what he thinks of me, I think. But yeah, I hope you guys are excited. You saw a style guide with a thing and you saw, hey, we can use this. We can make rules for our components. So now we're going to take it a step further and we're going to formalize that. So I'm here to talk about atomic design. That's what the talk's really about. I'm going to actually just run through this really quickly. I suggest you Google this and learn about it. So atomic design is a way of thinking about your components in your style guide. We break our components up into small parts that we have parity with molecular science because we think we're cool like that. And we say atoms. Atoms are the base building blocks of your UI, of your style guide. So an atom would be something like an icon or an input. It's used everywhere and it's used generally in the same way everywhere. The same markup, the same classes, it's there. So an icon or an input. A molecule is just a collection of atoms. So you have across your site inputs that always have an icon next to them. We call that an icon input. That's a molecule. An organism is a group of molecules. Hooray, it's easy. So you have an icon input and a button and maybe some validation. That's an organism, so it's a grouping. Then we have templates and pages, which are basically the same thing, but they aren't. So pages are the actual things in your site, the places you visit with the data, and templates are just representations of that with placeholder data. So this can be a title, this is body text, all of that. And templates and pages are collections of organisms. Okay, so like I said, super quickly about atomic design. Go read up on it, it's going to make your life way more better. Right. Now, let's get to keeping stuff modular. We spoke about components. We spoke about having small little reusable things. So there's a bunch of stuff that you can do to make your UI more modular. One of those things is React, which we're not allowed to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it. So just a very, very quick React example of a component library. So this is the React component library, which I built, shameless shill. You guys can find this on my GitHub repos, or actually on the Polar Bear repos. What we have here is what we talked about, some atoms, some organisms, and then many other things. And let's look at, for example, an input. We can see here that this is a React input. It has some properties. So it can either be invalid and it has a label, and then all the other general input stuff you can pass to it, which we all know. We can see, oh, this is how I use it in React. I just say it's an input with the label and it's invalid. Or I'm lazy and I like HTML. That's what the HTML markup looks like for an input. What we notice here is that the React is like one line, and the HTML is many, many lines that you're going to have to remember. Where what React allows us to do is encapsulate these lines. So we're going to look at something here. On the style guide, I have a page called app, right? And snap, 2 pages. These represents all the forms in your application everywhere. Your client comes to you and says, okay, cool, I love the application you built for me, but what I really, really want is that for every single label, on every single input on the site, keeping in mind we have like 500 forms, this should take you 10 seconds, to add that you're paying me money for this, right? So you go away, I don't want to update all 500 forms, or you go, oh sure, yeah, we use React, let's do that. So we go to our component library over here, we bump up the font size so people can actually see what I'm doing, and then we go into our atoms, the input, and we say, okay, here's our definition for the input. We see there's the label, and we want to say, you are paying me for this. Boom, save, and because we are magic in the world of Webpack and React, it's going to update itself and reload the page for me. Look at that. Cool. And I go to the other page, and it's telling me you're paying me for this. And our entire application has just been updated. If I want to change the markup of an input, if I want to change the general style of an input, there's one place. Don't have to worry about it. It's React. That's keeping things modular. Right. Cool. Back to the talk. Right. React and Webpack, there's some bullet points here. That's just what I went over. You have small little items that you can use everywhere. They're self-contained. Everything you need for that component is there. So if I look at this React component, I see that it's an input, and I have all the JavaScript related to this input is there. If I want to add a generic change handler to my inputs that say all input data should be sanitized before it's sent off to another function, I do it there. It's awesome, right? It's amazing. And the CSS and stuff is all packaged up inside of our component library. Webpack, I'm not going to go into Webpack because I can talk for many hours about Webpack, but Webpack allows us to build for different environments. So you can have definitions in your code that say if env equals prod, something like that, which it doesn't look like that, it looks like this, that's an if, that's a ternary if, or no, not a ternary if, whatever. So if it's prod, you say prod. If it's not prod, you say not prod. So you can have those kind of definitions in your code with Webpack. Webpack provides those variables to your code, and then you can compile for different environments. Very useful. Take a look at Webpack. It does way more than just different environments. Okay, next up, CSS, which is a JavaScript conference, and we're talking about CSS. I'm sorry. BEM. What is BEM? BEM is kind of like atomic design. It's a process for writing CSS and designing and building components and stuff. So let's look at how it breaks up. So BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. Block is a grouping of things on your page. It's a collection of elements. An element is a single thing on your page, an input, an icon, things like that. And a modifier is a change to an element or a block. So an input is invalid, an icon is green, something like that. Right. So I have an example for you. This is actually interactive HTML, and we have a form. This form is made up of a validation list, an input, and a button, and a container for the form. What does the HTML markup look like for this? It's a form with a validation list, some inputs, and a button. very straightforward. You'll notice that the classes look a tiny bit weird. So you see everything here is prepended by example. Generally, that would be your application name in BEM, either the current block or the application name. So this application is example. So inside of example, we have a block called form. Inside of the form block, we have a form validation list. Okay? So this is just giving things name spacing your CSS like you would your objects. Interesting. Let's look at the CSS for that. That's the example form. So we have our block, the example form, with its styles. We have the validation list with its styles, and we have an item inside of the validation list. What I want you to notice here is that I am not taking the validation list and saying, for my children, I want these styles. So I'm not putting the validation list item color inside of the validation list and saying, all divs that are children of me get this style. I'm implicitly saying, this item is technically separate from the validation list. It has its own styles. I'm saying they're related by giving them the same name, the same prepend form validation, but they are separate. So we don't have CSS specificity issues, and we don't have CSS clashing issues. Okay? The same thing goes for the inputs. What we have here is a modifier. So modifiers in BEM are shown with 2 dashes at the end of the class name. So I have an example label. When it is invalid, I give it that color. If we go back to the markup, we will see that I have an input example, and the example is invalid, and it renders as such. Right. And that's the buttons, nothing much different here. Want you to notice that I'm doing the active and hover classes separate from the button because they are separate entities, they are separate behaviors. Okay, cool. I am now going to hand off to the wonderful Garren to do his inferior approach, which is tachyons.
I catch a lot of abuse from Ben about tachyons. But the main thing about the CSS when building a component library is to have something consistent. Go with a specific way of doing it. BEM is a great methodology. Tachyons is a little bit different, but choose one of them and then constantly stick with that. That way then when people come onto your team and are working on the component library, they still then are able to work with it and know exactly what's going on and how to kind of, that's a great way of making sure your CSS just doesn't blow up, which it does in most applications. So tachyons is completely different to BEM, and it's actually where BEM is a methodology of working. Tachyons actually is a framework, but we kind of want to talk about it because it's something really different and a different way of looking at CSS. So the idea of tachyons is that you actually have lots of small classes. Each class actually just does one thing. So it's very isolated, and in fact, it's almost a very functional way of looking at CSS. So each class does one thing and there's no side effects. You can have one class that just sets the display as an inline block. It doesn't do anything else. So the idea then is that you actually write very little CSS of yourself. You just kind of use the library. And with tachyons, it was also built to be mobile first. So the idea is that it scales out really well. You can design for the iPhone. It's really easy to adjust for it to build to look great on an iPad or look great on a desktop. It works very well like that, and it's very responsive. It's built off kind of the idea of a whole lot of ratio. So everything always scales depending on what screen size it is. So I'm not as cool as Ben. I didn't write like 5 pages of CSS to show you what it is. I just did one. And I just chose 3 buttons. So 3 buttons are kind of showing the different styling on those buttons. And basically, you can see here, you actually don't write any custom CSS. You just define a whole lot of classes. And in this one, you kind of see the top one, the first one has got its DIB, which just means just make this one a display inline block. BR2 means make the border radius 2, so that's a specific ratio. And a PV2 makes the padding vertical 2. So it's very repetitive in the fact that each time you build an HTML component, you're defining all of these things over and over again. That's where something like React kicks in really nicely, is that you build this component once, you define all these classes on it, and it's then done, and it's one place where you can centralize and design your whole component library. One of the kind of subtle things is version control. This is really nice. If you're building a full JavaScript, how did I just blow that up? Sorry. you're building a component library, you want to be able to version control. You want to make sure that the version this application works is locked down. If anyone makes any changes to anything, that it doesn't affect any applications that are running in production or anything like that. And if you're using something like NPM, this is like really trivial to do. In your component library or style guide, you just kind of define your package.json, set a version if you want to, bit of a description so everyone remembers what it is. And at that point, in your application is really where you, just in your dependencies, you reference your style guide, and if you got it on GitHub, it's really easy. You just use your username and the library, or you can just use a straight Git URL. But the most important part then is the confusing SHA at the end of that. That's just a standard Git SHA, so it knows which version from Git, which commit I must choose and which one I must set it at. In that way, then your application is always running off a specific version, and you can iterate further without affecting anything in production and knowing what changes are being made. So a design system or style guide, it really helps the application behavior. It makes something consistent and defined and easy to work with. The consistency is always the most important, sometimes even across multiple applications. If you had one company, you want each application to still be branded the same way, still have the same user feel. It definitely allows for faster development. You've got all your components built out. You can just pull them into your application and focus purely on the business logic. And if you stick to a nice, consistent CSS styling, you can make your CSS maintenance a lot easier. Thanks for listening. I'm Garren Smith on Twitter, Ben Janecke on Twitter. Any questions or anyone who wants a book? We have 3. We can only give away 1.
Remember, the condition for the book is that you just explain what that image at the beginning of the talk was. So we go back to that any second now. That's me drinking beer. There it is. It works.
Yeah, okay. Down in front, yeah?
It's fake because there's some perspective issue. If you look at where the guy jumps over the car, it looks kind of out of perspective. I think the car is too small in relation to the guy.
Okay, yeah, this guy disagrees.
Okay, disagrees. So, we all drive cars.
Yeah.
If you see somebody in a road like that, what are you going to do? You immediately going to brake and swerve out. Nobody swerves, nobody even slows down.
Okay, I'll take one more to see. Yeah?
I would say the cat. It wouldn't just walk into oncoming cars.
I think cats are awesome. Any other actual proper questions? No. Okay. Sorry, the guy back. Yeah.
We were actually having an argument in-house about 2-3 weeks ago about something very similar to we use CSS, which is a variation, implementation of that. And we were, I'm specifically referring to Tachyon now. And the argument was basically that isn't Tachyon basically the same as doing inline styling, or something similar to Tachyon doing inline styling, because you end up having a lot of your style sitting in your markup instead of being in your CSS. So your separation of concerns is completely destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah, yes and no. Yeah, yes and no. When you're doing inline styling, each one you're going to style and you're going to say background of green and then like border radius of 1, where you're going to consistently throughout, you're going to choose your specific classes. So I would say no. I'd say it's quite different to that. I'd say the big mindset is that you're going to be repeating a lot of your classes when you assign to each component, and you're going to give it a lot of CSS classes. But I mean, that doesn't really affect performance in any way, but it does in some sense. No, yeah, sorry, I can't think. It doesn't really affect. I don't think it. When I've used it, it hasn't felt like.
My issue is more that it breaks the separation of concerns between your HTML and your CSS.
Yeah.
Because it's so fine-grained.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's a change in like for me, it was like if you say referring back to React. The first time you use React, you use JSX, and everyone's like, "Oh, this is ridiculous. This is the dumbest thing ever. Who puts HTML in their JavaScript?" But you got to try it out a little bit, and then you're like, "Oh, wait a minute. Okay, I see where you're going with it." So. In some cases it really works, some cases it might not. But it is an interesting thing to raise, kind of thinking about it from that, yeah. I think, Kenneth, you still got a question?
Kind of. Maybe a bit of feedback. If you use a component library, then the Tachyon thing makes a lot of sense. Like we're using that semantic UI,
Yeah.
just the CSS part of it.
Okay.
what I was thinking is that maybe if you don't have a component library like a best of both, use SAS, you can make your BEM modules, and you can include those tachyon style classes straight in the BEM syntax, and then would that be a way to go to kind of like find it? Because I love BEM, but it gets so verbose so quickly.
Yeah, I would strongly suggest against that. Sorry, but the idea of BEM is encapsulation and definition of a single component. So the moment you include a framework or a library that is mixing into those classes, it means that it's leaking into that component. If it changes there, it changes here. What we want is a strong definition for the component, if that makes sense. I don't completely slate it, but it's dangerous.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, you can. Completely. Yeah, but Bootstrap is strongly defined. You use that outside.
Okay. Sorry?
So when you guys see Tachyon and BEM as sort of like independent things that don't complement each other, the way that I've always worked, well not always worked, I mean I've gone back and forth between that class-heavy HTML elements versus module writing in an actual class. And the sort of strategy that I've come up with now is I use style guides as well. And a big part of my style guides is that I know exactly what all my margins and paddings and font size and all those sorts of things look like, abstracted outside of components. And then when I need them on specific components, I'll put them on that component. But as soon as it's pre-modified on certain elements, then I think, okay, now it's time this thing needs to be its own name component. And then if it has additional sort of modifiers that it needs, then I might like more sort of modified on that component. So it's interesting that you guys see a different sort of.
I think, I think the big thing comes down to it's a balance. Like, if that works for you, that's awesome, as long as it can be consistently applied so that other people in the team can understand your mindset. Like if you kind of here and there pulling what you like, but there's no consistency, I think that's where something like that might break down. But other than that, I like the idea. Ben wants to disagree with you.
I'm going to take the one at the back and just finish up at the front. So you can use other libraries and things in conjunction with BEM. What you don't want is those libraries to leak into your BEM components. So you use, say Bootstrap, you use a button from Bootstrap, and you use the styles for that button. But you don't let the Bootstrap styles influence your BEM styles. So you can use BEM components inside of the Bootstrap, you can use Bootstrap inside of the BEM components, but the styles never commingle. They don't clash with, they don't mix with each other.
Yeah, so like for example in Zerb, sorry, I'm taking up time here, but you got like text align left, for example, is one of the standard classes for alignment. Yeah. So if you use text align left, you'd have to declare your own text align left to use it in your component.
No, so you just say text align left for this block, or text align left for this component.
Okay.
Okay.
Any more questions? We've got like one more question.
At the back.
So, almost related to what you just described, but in terms of existing frameworks, example, Bootstrap, etc., that already have these components, and how does it fit into those ecosystems in terms of less SAS and the rest of it? How do all these tools that we already have work together and give us a better developer experience?
Okay, so the question is about the tools we have. Tools and frameworks we have available and how they communicate, how they interact, right? So harking back to one of the early slides, component libraries are primarily about process, not implementation. It's about thinking about the way you build your components, you structure your code. If you are using a tool, if you take a tool and you say, I think this is going to be good for us, we are going to integrate it into our components or into our library or into our style guide, then you're winning. That's kind of the point. If you are just using a tool because it makes your life easier without thinking about it, then I don't know. But if you have a strong definition of these are my things, using this tool makes my things better, you're good. And yeah, that's my feels. Garren?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Time's up. Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone.